The Voice of the People by Jean Vautrin. So this is a work of historical fiction which is about the Paris Commune. I'll talk about the Paris Commune briefly first before I get into this book. I've actually done several videos now on books related to the Paris Commune. It's an interest of mine. Paris Commune was a revolution in Paris. It took place in 1871, in which kind of the working class or the radicals were able to take control of Paris for 2 months. They elected a provisional government, set up like a temporary government for those 2 months, and then they were crushed by the main French army, which had temporarily evacuated from Paris during the uprising, but then just came back to crush everybody. I've been interested in it because it seems to me to be kind of at this fascinating juncture in history, where it's at the one point kind of the end of the old French revolutions, right? So there was a number of French revolutions during the 19th centuries and kind of minor uprisings. Where, you know, you have kind of your classic images of French Revolution, right? The barricades and, well, on the barricades, the people up on the barricades. But it's also kind of the beginning of the modern era. Karl Marx was associated with the Paris Commune. Now, if you dig into this a little bit, Marx's relationship to the Paris Commune is a whole nother topic. But his name was tied to it, at least. And then kind of, I guess, socialist and communist and kind of anarchist traditions have been closely associated with the Paris Commune. So it was kind of like the first modern revolution of kind of the modern left and kind of the last revolution of kind of the old French Republicans, arguably. Or I don't know, maybe you could make the case that 1848 was the first kind of revolution where the modern left was solidified. Point being, it's at this kind of interesting juncture in history where it's kind of the end of one era and the beginning of another. I was also interested in radical politics when I was younger, this is a big moment in radical history. Okay, historical fiction then. I have always loved historical fiction. I've been a huge history buff all my life, but I also really like novels. So if I can get kind of historical information through the pleasure of reading a novel, that's my preference. I've known other history buffs who don't like historical fiction, precisely because there is some fictional elements mixed in with it, but I quite enjoy it. In fact, I don't know whether this is something I should be admitting or not, but most of my knowledge of ancient Rome comes from historical fiction. Various I. Claudius and Colleen McCullough's Masters of Rome series, etc. And there, you know, there's a lot of historical fiction written around about the ancient world. Kind of modern history, not quite as much, it's a bit more touch and go. But when I became interested in the Paris Commune and when I started reading a lot about it, I thought, I wonder what kind of historical fiction I can find about the Paris Commune. So, you know, I Googled it, put it into Amazon, and I came up with 3 books. One is The Debacle by Émile Zola. I've already reviewed that one. And that's interesting, it's worth reading. It's primarily about the Franco-Prussian War. And the Paris Commune is just a little bit at the end. But it is a historical fiction book that includes the Paris Commune. Another one which I haven't reviewed yet on this YouTube channel, but will soon, hopefully, or will eventually, is The Werewolf of Paris. And this is an interesting book. But this is also not primarily about the Paris Commune. This is, it's about a werewolf story, and the Paris Commune is kind of in the background. And then there's this book, The Voice of the People by Jean Vautrin. if I've missed out on anything, or if there's other kind of historical fiction books anybody knows about the Paris Commune, by all means, put them in the comments and let me know about them. These are the only ones I've been able to track down. Anyways, of these three, this last one, The Voice of the People by Jean Vautrin, is the one that's most focused on the Paris Commune. The beginning of the book starts right with the beginning of the Paris Commune. The ending of the book is right with the ending of the Paris Commune. All the plot in between is happening during the Paris Commune. Now, it's not... like on a scale of historical fiction, in terms of like how historically focused they are, this one's kind of in the middle. So in the middle, it kind of loses a bit of focus on the real history and kind of follows its fictional characters, follows those plot threads instead. But it is, yeah, as far as I can tell, and again, somebody let me know if I'm wrong, if you're looking for historical fiction that focuses on the Paris Commune, this seems to be the best that's out there, or the most focused. It's originally written in French and was translated into English. The author is Jean Vautrin, who I'm probably mispronouncing his name. And actually, I have to make this disclaimer every time I talk about French history. I never learned French, so I'm going to mispronounce everyone's names. I'm sorry. I'll try and at least make a grimace as I mispronounce it, so that you know that I know I'm pronouncing it wrong. But yeah, with that being said, I'm just going to plow on through this and mispronounce everyone's names. Anyways, Jean Vautrin, or however that name is pronounced. If you go to Wikipedia, apparently he died in 2005, but he was a French film director and author and kind of well-known personality in France. But yeah, in addition to being kind of a screenwriter and director, he was involved in the movie industry in some capacity. He also wrote novels, and so yeah, this is his novel on the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune, I was mentioning before, is kind of the last big revolution in France with the barricades and everything like that. Actually, sorry, I'm thinking as I'm talking. In May 1968, they put up barricades as well, didn't they? French just love barricades. But anyways, it kind of brings to mind like Les Miserables or Victor Hugo or that kind of thing. And I have every reason to suspect that this book is influenced by Victor Hugo. It seems like he's trying to do for the Paris Commune what Victor Hugo did for the... When was Les Miserables? The uprising of 1832. Anyways, the plot is a little bit complex, just like Les Miserables, maybe. You've got Grandin, who's an ex-convict prisoner who has escaped from his past and become a police commissioner under an assumed identity. Well, that's Jean Valjean, isn't it? He's also seeking revenge on Tarpeignant, who he thinks killed his heir. Now, Tarpeignant has his own character arc. Tarpeignant is a former army officer who turns over and joins the Paris Commune during the March 17 revolution. He also falls in love with Gabriella Poussy, who is the mistress of the most powerful crime underlord in Paris. So yeah, I think Les Miserables also had kind of like subplots dealing with the Paris kind of underworld. So again, it seems to be echoes of Les Miserables. All three of these paths converge on the barricades during the fall of the Paris Commune. The first confrontation between Grandin and Tarpeignant is cleverly woven in with the historical March 17th uprising on the Butte Montmartre. So that's kind of the beginning of the Paris Commune. And the final scenes with the final confrontations are again flawlessly interwoven with the historical collapse of the Paris Commune in the chaos of the fighting of the barricade. However, although the book starts with a bang and it finishes with a bang, the middle of the book lags. So this is where the book starts to get a little bit boring. The middle of the book moves in towards the Paris criminal underworld. And at this point, we kind of depart from the politics of the Paris Commune, which I can understand a bit, because at this point, the politics of the Paris Commune, there's an in-between stage where they're not fighting on the barricades, where there's kind of meetings of the Central Committee going on. And this would kind of make a very boring backdrop to have this kind of love romance subplot going on. So they kind of just ignore the Paris Commune for a while and then come back to it at the barricade scenes. But still, again, for those of us who pick up this book because we're interested in the Paris Commune, and you got to figure, most people who will go through the trouble of tracking this book down or picking it up do so because they're interested in the Paris Commune. Would have been nice to get a bit more of the historical details interwoven into the story. Maybe I'm being greedy. That being said, there is actually a bit. A number of the real historical figures of the Paris Commune do make cameos in this story. There's Louise Michel. I've previously reviewed a biography of her on this channel, but she gets a prominent scene at the beginning during the initial uprising, and then there are repeated references to her throughout the novel. Dombrowski, he wasn't French. He was a Polish general who was put in charge of the defense of the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune, again, was something that is tied in with Marxist or socialist history. So you, of course, socialism, you have internationalism. So the fact that he wasn't even French, but he was fighting for the French working class is kind of seen as a symbol of the internationalism of the Paris Commune. So he's featured in this book, and in fact, there's some scenes where he's fighting alongside some of the fictional characters. There's Gustave Courbet, who was a communist artist, who was later put on trial for organizing the destruction of Napoleon's Vendôme column. He pops up as another friend of Tarpignan, one of the main characters. But of all the historical communards who figure most prominently in this book, the one who figures the most prominently is Jules Valls. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, so I'll just spell it Jules, Jules Valls, Valles. Now, Jules Valls is an interesting guy, and in fact, again, on this channel, I've reviewed his memoirs of the Paris Commune. So I've also reviewed his memoirs of his childhood. So I know a bit about him myself. And I was able to pick up on these biographical details that had been in his memoirs that Jean Vautrin, the author of this book, has also integrated into his fiction. So if you've read Jules Valls' memoirs like I have, you can kind of see like, I know where he got that from. He's referencing that part in the memoirs. So, you know, some of that knowledge pays off a little bit here, although it's not necessary by any means. It actually, at certain points, it almost seemed a little bit too much. Like the author was trying to cram in too many references to Jules Valls' memoirs. It also... Yeah, I talked about this in my review of Jules Valls' memoirs, but Jules Valls has got kind of a Roman Aclef thing going in his memoirs, where he doesn't actually use his real name. He calls himself Jacques Vingtras. I'm mispronouncing that, I'm sure. In this book, the Voice of the People, they even kind of cram in a little section where you find out how he gets that fictional name that he used in his memoirs, which is arguably a little bit on the nose. You know, one of those things where it's like, what an interesting name. Maybe I will use that at some point in the future. Yeah, you know, it's like these things people complain about with prequels, where they kind of put some of these things too on the nose that didn't really need an explanation. It might have worked if it was just a throwaway joke, but they overemphasized it. The author was afraid you weren't going to get the message, so he brings it up a couple different times. Jules Valls also seems to be the mouthpiece for the author in this book. I think author Jean Vautrin's own views about the Commune are coming through Jules Valls. I think, although a lot of this is not really so much profound analysis, it's just kind of vague and cryptic remarks. For example, when describing the reasons for the fall of the Commune, Jules Valls, in this historical novel, says, "It's because philosophers and artists confuse their dreams, their cigar smoke, and the range of their spectacles with the hopes of hands distorted by toil." Yeah, okay, it sounds deep, I guess. I mean, who knows what that really means. Actually, there's something else, and I didn't even pick this up until I was on Wikipedia just recently. But Jules Valls had a newspaper that he kind of self-published during the Paris Commune, which I'm going to mispronounce, but it was Le Cri du Peuple. And I thought, that sounds a little bit like the cry of the people. And then I thought, that sounds like the voice of the people. And then I put it into Google Translate, and sure enough, the Voice of the People was the name of Jules Valls' magazine, newspaper, during the Paris Commune. So the entire name for this novel is based off of Jules Valls. And, you know, who knows, maybe this author has done more research than I have. Maybe he actually went through and looked at the newspaper articles that Jules Valls has published during the Paris Commune. Maybe that's even where some of these cryptic quotes come from. Who knows? On the whole, Jules Valls comes off more or less how I had pictured him after reading his books. Also, his dramatic escape at the end of the Paris Commune is integrated into the story. His real-life dramatic escape is integrated into this fictional story. The book never really gives any kind of insight or insight or analysis of the Paris Commune. Although what do you expect? It's historical fiction. But one theme it does hit very hard is just kind of the brutality of the repression of the Paris Commune, the massacres of the end of it. The author laments the slaughter of the poor by the Versailles army. He has several scenes depicting the slaughter. And he even integrates one of Victor Hugo's poems in here. So Victor Hugo had a poem called On the Barricades, which there were several barricades during the lifetime of Victor Hugo, but I think this one was referring to the Paris Commune. There's a story, the defenders of the barricades are rounded up and they're going to be shot, and there's this child who has a pocket watch. He says, "Please, sir, can I just go home and give the pocket watch back to my mother before you shoot me?" You can look this up online. The poem is called On the Barricade by Victor Hugo. They integrated in here into the novel. Supposedly in the novel this scene plays out. That said, I'm not entirely sure this succeeds in bringing across the full impact of the slaughter the way the author wants it to. I found that just reading a straight-up history of the Paris Commune by Lissagari, his History of the Paris Commune, I've also reviewed that previously, made these massacres seem a lot more real than all these kind of poems about boys and pocket watches. But again, this is historical fiction, so you know, you get what you signed up for. This is what I should have realized when I picked up the book. Okay, I'm going to complain about the author's style a little bit. Stylistically, I found this book confusing. And this was translated from French, So who knows, maybe it's the translator's fault. But here's a typical example. I'm quoting this out of context, but this maybe will give you a bit of an idea. 36 years old, a townsman born and bred, he was a long, pallid beanpole of a man, dressed in dark blue, and at present giving a fair imitation of a heron being mobbed by rooks. He was sticking his head out from behind the timber piling. So, yeah, the imagery here takes a while for me to get my head around and figure out kind of what the author is actually talking about. Now, another problem is that for whatever reason, the author or the translator or whoever kept varying the nouns by which they would refer back to the same character. So instead of just saying the character's name over and over again, he never uses the character's name twice on the same page, the narrator. He'll refer to him once by his given name, then the next time will be by his family name, then he'll say like captain, refer to his rank or position, and then he'll give a description of the person instead of saying his name. And then finally, once he's recycled through all of these, he'll go back to just using the character's name again. I found it confusing, especially at the beginning of the book when you're still kind of figuring out who all these characters are. It got better as I continued reading the book, or maybe the author's style just grew on me. All in all, I'd recommend this book if you like historical fiction. If you don't like historical fiction, just give this a pass. If you like historical fiction, it's worth checking out. It has some flaws, but it's an interesting story overall. I found it got better as I stuck with it, or at least it got more readable as I stuck with it. So yeah, it's one of these kind of obscure books. Actually, maybe it's not that obscure, but you can find it on Amazon or something like that.